I read a piece the other day in on the line, "What's Eating Liberal Democracy? The Lack of Community." A piece by Andrew Potter. So I went back and I found another story, which was "Self-Help for Partisans. Partisanship is a Disease. Seek Help." So this intrigued me. So we have Andrew Potter with us today. He is a journalist, a professor at McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy, was in an earlier life managing editor of the Ottawa Citizen, promoted to editor-in-chief. And of course, he's written books, which we will now refer to: The Authenticity Hoax, How We Got Lost Finding Ourselves, The Rebel Cell, Why the Culture Can't Be Jammed. And then this little gem here called On Decline, Stagnation, Nostalgia, and Why Every Year is the Worst Year. Oh my God, you are some depressing guy here.
It's a beautiful day out there. I'm looking out wondering what
I know,
what
I can see that. The sun shining here, the sun shining there. No, it's a larger point. I get it. So when you talk about liberal democracies, you don't necessarily mean government of the day. You're talking about liberal democracies, and they're not functioning well. What's your take?
So I am talking not about in particular things about the government of the day
We'll get to
anything like
that
that.
later.
Yeah. So the big picture, I guess it's just, we've been sort of narrating this thing for, even before Donald Trump got elected. We were talking about Brexit, and we're talking about various things, and it even goes back. We might get into it too. The end of the Cold War, and so the brief halcyon days after the Cold War in the 90s, and then after. But this general sense that things aren't well, and even though we measure things like GDP, and we measure health outcomes and so on, and it seems like things are getting better all the time, that there seems to be something lacking at the heart of our civil society, and it's an idea that I've been sort of worrying in various ways, and it's funny when you sort of look at what I've written. I'm obviously kind of unhappy about something, and it's not always clear what I'm unhappy about, right? but I guess it goes back to this old idea that has been around for centuries, that liberalism at its core is spiritually hollow, and that it doesn't, on its own merits, like this basket of rights and the right to vote and the right to have access to consumer culture and so on its own, doesn't feed the spirit in the way that humans tend to want. And that a lot of what we're seeing with the populism and the Brexit and the Trump and all this kind of stuff, and is actually a downstream consequence of a fundamental lack of meaning in our society.
And when you say community is the answer, I think of the work of Robert Putnam and guys like that who talk about social capital, and his book, the famous book Bowling Alone, which millions of Americans are bowling. They're just going to the alley by themselves, and that we are kind of seeing that sense of community, exacerbated, of course, by the pandemic, really kind of breaking.
Yeah, so you'll remember. I mean, you were a journalist, I think, back when Putnam was made his name in the early 2000s with that book Bowling Alone, right? Where he lamented, and he was talking about the United States in particular, right? He lamented when he looked at the decline of membership in clubs and groups and these sort of third ways, right? Not political parties and not your household, but these sort of like third places and third ways of social organization, the little platoons of society. And we had a really big conversation about this, right? I mean, you'll remember Canadians talked about it, North Americans talked about it. And then it kind of like 911 happened, and we became very paranoid, and we became very security oriented and so on. And then a whole lot of things happened, right? There was the 911, and then the credit crisis, and then Trump, and then the pandemic. And so it seems like we've been sort of taking these body blows as a society and not really confronting what was recognized to be 20 years ago as a fundamental problem, right? And then it's easy to sort of say the internet and the pandemic kind of broke everything, but they kind of did, right?
And they kind of did, and it was kind of getting ready to be broken.
That's right. Yeah. And I think we're we're coming out of the pandemic now, and I think we really need to think very seriously about what's eating us, and figuring out what we can do about it.
Here's some of the stuff. This chart was attached to the piece that I read. So percent, and this is probably American, percent who say these values are very important to them, okay, of people. Patriotism, down from 70 to 38. This is 98 to 23, 1998 to 23. Patriotism down 70 to 38. Religion, 62 down to 39. Having children, 59 down to 30. Community involvement, 62 down to 27. The only value that's going up is money. And that's not exactly a value.
Right? Yeah. Um, yeah, it's pretty grim when you look at that, right? And I believe that's American data, so
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
look at it. And we often as well as I do, like, Canadians will say, well, we're not as bad as the Americans and so on,
Right.
right? But
We'd like
maybe
to say that.
we like to say that, but maybe we are and maybe we're not. And
Yeah.
it's interesting. What kind of spurred me to write that recent piece in the Line about it was actually my wife, some colleagues of hers organized a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, and it was at a curling club here in Montreal,
Yeah.
and I've never curled, and
Careful now, I'm a big curling fan.
yeah, well, I
Yeah,
kind of wondered if
okay.
you were, and I never curled, and I was kind of like, oh, curling, right? And we went, and it was amazing. We put a team together, got my kids, and we got some friends, and we put together. My dad came down from Ottawa, and what really struck me was not only is curling actually really fun, it's extremely hard, but it's a lot of fun. But there was this whole community built around this curling club in downtown Montreal that I had no idea it existed, that a couple of colleagues of my wife's were working for. And they all sat around drinking beer in the middle of the afternoon and talking about this and that and these and those. And I thought, I could use more of this in my life.
Yeah. I think it is missing. It's hard. Like, I come and go back regularly to small town Saskatchewan, right? So there is a
Right.
community because literally I've known everybody for most of my life, but it is very different in an urban setting.
Right. Yeah, and this was like, I mean, I actually bike past the curling club every day on my way to work, and I've never given it a second look. And
Yeah,
realizing that
didn't
it's
know.
it's actually the locus of a very profound community. In fact, as it turned out, I met at the curling club a woman who lives two doors down from us, our house. Like, she's like, "What are you doing here?" And we're like, "You're a curler?" She's like, "I curl every weekend here." Right. It was, and now we nod on the street, and she shows me her curling brooms, and it's
Well,
pretty,
I do
it's
expect you
great.
to take it up now. I really do.
I just might.
And it's also a great event to watch. Like, I mean, everybody
It
thinks
is.
it's
Oh,
paint drying.
I
It
love
is not. It's a very strategic game. Anyway,
I
I'm
love the
getting
Briar.
sidetracked here.
Yeah.
Again, to go back to this question, and I was raising this issue with Alan Gregg that we talked to last week, about the book, The Big Sort, which has kind of come back, this Bill Bishop piece on, the clustering of like-minded America. And I think it happens here too. We end up, for all the obvious reasons, living in communities, choosing communities when we go to rent an apartment or buy a house or do whatever it is, where we recognize ourselves and where the conversations might be the same. Although you're just saying your neighbor two doors down, you didn't know she
Yeah.
curled.
Didn't know she curled. Yeah. Well, so this is really insightful. And in fact, so I just finished working on a project with the Public Policy Forum on
Mhm.
they've got one coming out on polarization, and we just
Right.
actually submitted it, so it's going to come out in a bit. And one of the interesting papers that they commissioned a bunch of papers we went through, and we sort of wrote a report on them. And one of them is about this big sort aspect, and what the author calls homophily, which is the idea that it's birds of a feather flock together, right? This
Yeah.
idea that we
Yeah.
tend to sort of, and that's always been around. Communities have always done that. And the take that the author puts on it is, she says, what's happened is that what the internet allowed is people to group into virtual communities, right? It doesn't have to be people you live around, right? You can sort of virtually sort yourselves, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? You can find people you want to play Dungeons and Dragons with, or
Right.
whatever, right? All over the world. But what's happened is the pressures of the internet have sorted us into what she calls virtual communities of comforting rage. That is, they are communities that have little in common other than that they're very angry about something
Right.
and angry at other people. And what that has resulted in is kind of the de facto politicization of every community we become a part of, because they're sorted around who they hate or what they hate or
Yeah.
what they don't like. And that's highly damaging, right? When people you barely know, what you have in common with them is that you're absolutely enraged about Pierre Poilievre or Justin Trudeau or Donald Trump or what have you, right?
Yeah.
Or trans or anything. And this is highly damaging to community, right? When communities are built on not positive things like curling or positive things about, the Lions Club, but negative things about just what you have, what that your shared dislikes and shared hatreds. And I think that's something we need to think about.
I mean, that's the knock on the echo chambers, which of course the internet highlights, but it kind of exists everywhere because that is the self-sorting process. But you're
Yeah.
right, it used to be about more positive stuff. You got together in your little group in your community because you like to do the same thing, or you all had kids, or whatever the connector was. But if it's
Yeah.
just anger and hate, then that has some really negative consequences, as we see with young kids and mass shootings and a whole bunch of stuff where they've spent too long in the basement, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, and this is where the pandemic becomes an issue, right? Because, I think, you and I could probably debate at great length the pandemic and the lockdowns and the things the steps that were taken, and I go back and forth on a lot of it.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is the number of conversations I have now with people who were very much pro lockdown, pro vaccination, pro everything, who now think, we went a bit crazy,
Yep.
and maybe we went a bit too far. And it's not because they now think that the government was wrong, but it's like maybe we misunderstood. We didn't properly balance some things that are very important, right? Like think about the number of high school students who basically missed 2 years of
Or
what
university
kind of
students who go
or
away for
university
that
students.
experience, they'll never get it
Yeah,
back, right?
they'll never get it back. And this is why I have a rant sort of brewing that I'm going to write at some point about what I call the great work from home swindle.
Yeah.
Because I have a lot of students who are graduating now with their master's degree in public policy, and a lot of them say, I kind of I want a remote job. I want to stay in Montreal and I
Yep.
want to work remotely
Yep.
for a while. And I'm like, do not take a remote job, right? It will kill your career. The work,
Yep.
and I've seen Office Space. I know what it's like to work in a cubicle, right? But you will meet friends, you will fall in love, you will work hard, you will have great things and terrible things happen at work, but you've got to get to work, right?
Yeah.
And
I
because
feel
otherwise
really
you're just on the line.
strongly about that. And I think, and I end up having these conversations with people to your point, which is, in retrospect, of course, it's easy, but even at the time, did we go too far? And it comes back to one other really interesting issue for me, which is, why did they disrespect me by not telling me the truth? Don't wear a mask, you
Right.
don't need one. All of a sudden you need a mask, when really we all knew that there was a shortage of masks. So why not
Yeah.
stand up and say, there's a shortage of masks. Please go home and find a scarf or a handkerchief and just use it if you're going to be out in public, instead of these things. So, I mean, that then
Yeah.
goes back to the trust in institutions and all of those things you're talking about.
That's right. And that's a big piece of the this polarization thing we have coming out.
Yeah.
It's written by Justin Ling, actually, the journalist
Yep.
who I'm just the editor. In fact, you should have him on when it comes out. He'd be great.
Yeah, we'll
Because
do.
and that's a big piece is just simply the damage that was done to authorities
Yeah.
because of that dishonesty is something that we're going to have. I mean, look, it's obvious. It's the damage is done and it needs to be fixed. Otherwise, we're in big trouble.
Okay, I want to come back to these notions. Like, here's the piece, I'm just going to quote from it here. This is the piece called Self-Help for Partisans that I referenced. Political disagreements are no longer seen as reasonable disputes among fellow citizens, but instead as pitting decent people with decent character against horrible people with horrible character. It has all become just so strongly ad hominem. And as you say, that the hate stuff that you're talking about. What, like,
Yeah.
try to dissect that a little bit.
So, um, I'm actually one of those people, and who actually thinks that political parties are a good thing.
Yeah,
And you know, you were on the Hill for a long time. You know that a lot of
yeah,
journalists are very anti-party and think that you know, we should free the MPs and all this, right? I think partisanship's a good thing. I
yeah,
think
I do
parties are a good
too.
thing. Um, and when I wrote that piece, the partisanship piece, Ken Bosencool, who I respect enormously, wrote me a piece saying, "Andrew, you can't be saying this kind of stuff. It's fine to join a party. It's a good thing, right?" And I said, "Ken, like it's actually, you know, yes, I agree in theory. You're one of the good guys. My concern is this, and it's not a new insight, right? But it's that the partisanship has a polarization aspect to it, right? It's no longer what once upon a time they called cool partisans, right? This idea that you would temper your viewpoints because you know you're out of power now, but maybe in 4 years you're in power, so maybe you want to just keep it cool a bit, right? That seems to have gone away. But the other aspect of it, I think, is that in the absence of other forms of community or social meaning, people are finding a lot of meaning in political views, broadly understood, right?
Yeah,
These political tribes, the woke versus the anti-woke, or what have you, and that's it's a dangerous situation, I think, when your political identities tend to take over everything, right? To
yeah.
the point where the other
It
side
becomes
becomes
your
just like
defining moment.
you're defining identity, and you just can't talk to other people because you don't even see them as on the same planet,
This the
and
space on
that's
the spectrum. I mean, I have been around the Hill for a long time, on and off in different
yeah,
incarnations. But it used to be. I mean, the red Tories and the blue Liberals, which is kind of where a lot of people were pretty close on the spectrum. And now the Liberals are out here, and the Conservatives are out here. Like that space is getting bigger, and the NDP is just kind of attached itself
where will they
to
do?
the
Yeah,
Liberals at this
who
point.
knows
So
what they
there's
do?
not much distinction between them. So that does make things more partisan in a negative way, as opposed to it's great to have a group. And the old days, and we'll talk about nostalgia in a minute, but the old days where people had these debates on the floor of the House of Commons and then all went out for a drink or dinner or whatever it was, and that doesn't happen to the same degree that it used to.
Right. Eh, Yeah, and that's just disturbing to hear. And this is one of the things where I have no views on how you fix that. Like
Yeah.
that's why in the piece I'm just like, you guys got to stop, right? Like, but that's
Stop
not. There's
yelling
no
at each other.
policy.
Yeah.
Stop yelling at each other. And you know, it'd be curious to know, like, is this a downstream effect of you know, changes to the funding model for parties? Is it
Yeah.
a consequence of you know, the fact that every MP now has their own YouTube channel? Like, what are the drivers of this? Because it's not just Canada, right? It's not
Yeah.
just, but I assume there are some institutional factors, but also there's got to be bigger cultural factors as well. And Canada, you know, we're not entirely a cork on the waves here, but we're also not necessarily controlling our own boat. Like the sea of culture that comes to the United States of America on all sides is
Yeah.
is obviously something that
Well, I mean, just watching the Trump thing the other night, and the debate now around that about, CNN kind of in a bid for clicks and viewers because their numbers are in the tank, decide, they know he'll draw numbers, he'll bring the Fox number. They're getting trashed for their journalism. He's getting trashed, obviously, for all the crazy stuff he said. But now we're kind of down to this. This is lions in the theater here. I mean, it's quite garish.
it's quite garish. Did you watch the Trump thing?
I
Did you see
did.
it?
I watched a couple of chunks of it, but I was waiting for the coverage afterwards, which I then watched.
Right.
So of course, Fox totally ignored the event because it was on CNN, and CNN
Right.
immediately put all the reporters on to say what a horrible human being he was, right? And so it was kind of, well, okay, if you invented him the first time, why are you reinventing him the next time, right?
Right. Yeah, I just saw the one clip of Anderson Cooper kind of saying, "Well, that was awful, but you needed to hear it, right?" And I was like, I don't know if I did.
Oh, it was really quite intense because the sort of the moralizing after the fact that they, anyway, it's what I raise it in part because what we hear all the time, and this kind of, I wanted to come back to this, your statement at the beginning about sort of liberalism as we know it, Western liberalism is kind of hollow at its core because we seem to be watching a lot of things unfold, and we hear it in the States, which is, if Donald Trump did what Joe Biden did, it wouldn't have been acceptable. We hear it here. If Stephen Harper had done what Justin Trudeau does, it wouldn't have been acceptable. So we've got that kind of going on. So what does that reflect? Are we just really looking at competence in terms of people's ability to manage very complicated ideas? And if we just point at the other guy and say he would have been worse, or the rules are different for me, like, how are you packaging that?
That's a good question, and I don't know what to make of it because, I mean, I remember after the Trudeau government was elected, I would do a weekly radio show with who's now the mayor of Ottawa,
Yes.
Mark Sutcliffe. He had a radio show, and I would do it once a week, and it was basically turning into the show. I said to Mark, we should just call it "What if Stephen Harper did that?"
Yes.
Because every week
Right.
we would just sort of like talk about something that the government had done and ask, imagine. Um, you know, you probably know this better than I do, but my view is that governments are sincere with a lot of the things they say when they come into power.
Yep.
And
Agree.
for whatever reason, they decide that they can't do what they said they would do, or it's not in their interests, or what have you. And
Right.
at some point, they convince themselves that their failure to do what they said they were going to do is actually a sign of their virtue. Um, and I see it with, just take one example, right? Electoral reform, right?
Yep.
Do I think that Justin Trudeau was sincere when he said that this was going to be the last election held under First Past the Post? I think he probably did believe it. I think there were some of the things in his platform that were kind of BS, but I think that one he probably intended. Um, but now, having not followed through on it, it's a sign of him protecting us from the
Right.
evil right wing, the
Populism that's afoot. Yeah.
populism and so on, right? That's why. So
Yeah.
it becomes a virtue, right? And I think that's actually the way the thinking goes. And I say this as an outsider and someone who finds partisans kind of curious. Um, what you do about that is I don't know. I mean, Andrew Coyne has written 10 million columns about this problem and how it ought to be fixed. I don't know what to do other than I don't know. I can
When
stop
you
there. I
talk
don't know what to
about,
do.
though, liberalism or like, democracy, people use all the phrases that, we're in decline, we're in some state of decline. Because on the day-to-day basis, you look at any government and you say, okay, that's a competence issue. We should have been able
Yeah.
to figure out what the Chinese were up to in Canada. We should have done something about that. We should have been able to get people out of Afghanistan. We should have been able to get some masks and some, vaccine out to Canadians. So is that like a competence of the government of the day, or have we, I think, as you've talked about, in some cases, reached the limits of our capacity to deal with really complicated, big problems?
Yeah, so I think it's the latter, mostly the latter. I think so, and I'm glad you raised this because my thesis when I say on decline is
Yeah.
it's not it's easy to sort of think, oh, on decline. It's like a Hollywood movie, right? The apocalypse is
Yeah.
coming, and it's all global warming plus this and that. Life can keep getting better by a lot of measures. In a way that's consistent with the idea that we're actually kind of hitting the skids a bit. I mean, I
Yeah.
read this amazing thing yesterday. The MNRI vaccines that they sort of developed for the pandemic. There's now one against pancreatic cancer that they're
Mhm,
testing.
mhm.
Like, can you imagine a vaccine against pancreatic cancer? Like, it's like amazing, right?
Yeah,
And I remember when my book came out, a friend of mine sent me, he said, I was reading this while reading about the James Webb Telescope unfolding and taking pictures of the universe, right? He goes, so where's the
right.
decline here? And so where is the decline here? The decline is this, that life gets better in the sort of just everyday sense of smoothing out the problems and getting us out of our local tribal groupings and our local paranoid habits by enabling collective action, right? Increasingly large groupings of collective action. I mean, and that's what government does, right? Government allows for collective action.
Is supposed to, that's
It's
right. Yeah.
supposed to, right?
Yeah.
And most of the problems we face as humans of social organization are collective action problems, right? Everything from too much traffic to climate change. And so what stops collective action is this idea that, well, what's good for me is not necessarily what's good for the group. And it's okay for me to do what's in my self-interest because the group interest is not my interest, or group interest be damned. And I think to the extent to which government is failing or you lose that trust, people will only go along with a government regulation or a resolution when they trust that everyone's on the same page, right? When
Yeah.
people are there's no favorites being played, that nobody's suckering them by getting away with, they get to emit their carbon emissions, and while I'm sitting here paying the
Right.
carbon tax, right? People want to
Why
believe
is
that
Prince Harry on a private jet when yeah.
right. Why they, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Why is one leader flying around a Challenger jet while I'm,
Right.
spending a fortune on my carbon tax, right? And so they have to believe that they're not being suckered, and they also have to believe that the overall objective is fair and just, and so on. And I think that's when I say that we're hitting decline, it's hitting at the limits of that. I think that we're hitting the limits of government's ability to effectively implement solutions to collective action problems, increasingly big ones.
Yeah, I
And
mean, we see it on so many fronts. As you say, there's always a great idea, there's a budget, or we're going to solve the healthcare problem, or and I think at some level there is intent. I'm just not sure it's possible. We blame it on a lot of stuff, a difficult premier, or a prime minister that's not engaged, or a leader of the opposition that's undermining whatever the issues are. But somebody, if they wanted to fix stuff, could, but it doesn't look like it's really possible.
yeah, and that's right. And there's a line from a book that I quote where the guy says, he says, we're in this stagnation, and he says, but it's not the
Mhm.
great stagnation. He calls it the great strangulation. He says we've done it to ourselves, right? There's regulations and rules and
Right.
interest groups and so on. And it's interesting. So we have here at Max Spell, we get all sorts of eminent people coming through, and Lisa Raitt and Anne McClellan were here earlier this week.
Yeah.
As part of their, have you seen their coalition for
Yeah, we just had them
prosperity?
at the banking committee the other day. They're doing they're trying to do some interesting stuff.
Yeah, they're trying to do some interesting stuff, and I thought it was great, right? Because having two people on opposite sides of the aisle, former
Yeah.
cabinet ministers, right, coming through was great, and the students loved it. But I asked Anne, I said, let me ask you a question. Where does federalism fit into the story you want to tell about this?
Yeah.
And she said something that kind of like I kind of suspected, but was disturbing to hear from her. She said it's a huge obstacle.
Yeah.
She said federalism right now is an obstacle to the agenda we want to advance for
To
prosperity,
just solving
inclusiveness, and
problems.
sustainability. Just it's not, and that is exactly the opposite of what federalism is supposed to do. Federalism is supposed to help resolve collective action problems, right? And if a former cabinet minister and someone who's trying to make us more prosperous is saying it's actually in the way, like that's a serious problem
Yeah.
about the
We're
functioning
hearing
of the.
this stuff all the time. We're doing this study at banking right now on business investment. It's the same thing we hear about Canada. We've got all these resources in the world, and we've got an educated population, but nobody wants to invest here. and we don't want to invest in ourselves, and we give it all away. We give away all the intellectual property for free because we don't have the same mindset that the Americans do in terms of really being entrepreneurial in that way. But at the bottom, I mean, everybody has said to us in one way or another, it's about that notion of not being able to think bigger. It's about attitude, which is, this is enough. I'm just going to take my little piece of change. But everybody also says loud and clear, we can't do anything. There's too many contradictory regulations and rules, and you solve the federal problem and then the province says this. And we've kind of, I mean, I like that great strangulation, because that's how I see it. These giant
Yeah.
octopuses that are,
Right. I
taking
mean,
the air out of us.
yeah, I mean, I tell my students, because they write these little policy briefs on, housing or mental health or whatever, right? And
Yeah.
invariably they all say we need a national strategy. And I'm like, if I hear national strategy of anyone, you're all getting an F, right? I do not want to hear national strategy out of
Yeah.
one of you.
Well, I've got to be before this. There's so many things I want to talk about, because your books touch on so many things. But the one that really struck me was this whole thing about nostalgia.
Yeah.
The timeline on nostalgia. We used to think back to the 50s and Leave It to Beaver and that kind of stuff. Now nostalgia is yesterday. Like, we're talking about great hits of the early 20s.
Yeah, well, I mean, this game people play where they're like, whereas Madonna's hit single "Like a Virgin" is as close to World War II as it is to today. That kind of stuff makes me crazy.
Yeah.
I saw one yesterday that killed me. It said, if they were making Back to the Future today, he'd go back to 1993. That's when Marty
Yes.
McFly would go back, right? I was like, okay,
Yeah, exactly.
kill me now. The nostalgia piece is an interesting thing, and I'm not sure where to go with it necessarily. It's interesting. One of the things I had to do was turn off on my phone the nostalgia machine that Google. I don't know if you have
I
Google
don't.
Photos. So what Google Photos does, and Facebook does the same thing, is that every day they send you a thing saying, look back 7 years, and they'll send you a link, and they'll grab some photos out of your Google Photo archive, and they'll do this little montage of your kids pushing your kids on a swing or something, right? And I sent one to my wife once, and she came in and she said, "Stop sending me these things, right? They're killing me, right? Like, it's like
Yeah.
I can't because this
This
constant
time
awareness,
is fleeting. Yeah.
the constant awareness of it, and so on." Where I think nostalgia becomes dangerous, and Francis Fukuyama had a great line in, and I quote it in the book at some length, because his original end of history essay, which he wrote in like 1987 or 88, right, at the end of during the Glasnost era, you'll remember everyone when that came out, everyone's like, "Oh, it's Western imperialism and triumphalism," and he's saying the
Right.
West has won all that, right? But the last paragraph, he says, the end of history is not going to be a good time. It's going to be a time of an absence of spirit, an absence of the understanding of what makes life great, what makes life worth living for, and almost maybe even worth dying for. And he says that he worries that we'll get stuck in this endless nostalgia. This what he calls the curation of the museum of human history, where we'll just sort of look back and think about back in the good old days and this, because there'll be nothing really pushing humanity forward. And I remember when I first read, I was kind of like thinking, well, what does that amount to, right? And one of the things he kind of warns against is dictators coming to power based on nostalgia, right? And this is pure Putinism, right? What Putin is doing is an exercise in USSR nostalgia, right? And it's hard not to see that as right, as a straight response to the 1990s, right, when everyone was like, "Okay, the Soviet Union's done. Now we're going to move forward." And Putin's like, "No, actually, we're not done." Right? That was a huge mistake, letting that go. And so I think it's one thing to sit there and look through photos on your phone of your kids when they were like 18 days 18 days younger or something like that, right? But this constant sense that the past never really goes away, I think, is something that's a bit dangerous.
But it is part of the current political discussion too, because it's how Republicans and Democrats or conservatives and liberals define each other. That, the liberals or the conservatives are small c conservative, and they want to go back to the good old days where everybody went to church and everybody paid their bills and the budgets were balanced, and the liberals are supposed to be the new thinkers, and but it's not that clear.
Yeah, it's not that clear. And in fact, one of the most interesting things I think that's happened that no one's really picked up on in a systematic way. I tried and articulated a bit in the Decline book, but it was my friend Joe Heath, the philosopher, who
Yep.
sort of really kind of nailed me on this. Was he said, because Joe and I wrote this book on the counterculture, the rebel cell,
Yeah.
where we talked about how for 40 years there was this idea that the forces of conformity were the conservatives, right? It was like the old moral majority and so on, and the left were all about rebellion and individualism and undermining order and stability. And that is completely flipped. That flipped about a decade ago, right? Where the left is now the forces of conformity, about what you can say, what you can think, where you can go, and it's the right that has sort of adopted this mantle of. I mean, they call itself the new counterculture, right? The right
Yeah.
is the new counterculture. They're the ones who are basically going around, and I think a lot of that, a lot of the racism, I think, frankly, is not real racism. It's look what I can get away with saying. Look what I can get away with doing. This makes liberals crazy, right? So I'm gonna be anti this and anti that. And I think that if we don't understand the extent to which there's an element of the conservative movement in the world now, but largely in the United States, that is devoted to essentially chaos in a way the old anarchist left was. If you don't
Yeah.
understand
Well,
that, then I think you're
that's how
missing a big
everyone
part of the
describes
puzzle.
Trump, right? It's just
Right. It's chaos
exactly.
monger.
I mean, it
Yeah.
is
And
chaos and the upsetting
it's
the apple
chaos.
cart, right?
Yeah, and the left is responding, I think, in a really unhelpful way by almost sort of taking the bait, right?
Mhm.
And so all this stuff, like I see it with campus politics and so on. It seems to die down a bit, but a couple of years ago it was pretty crazy, right? Where the conservative groups would deliberately invite somebody hateful onto campus, knowing full well the campus lefties would go crazy and shut them down, and then everyone would declare victory and walk back
Yeah.
to their corner of the ring.
But you do
Um,
have some of those changes that, the conservative voices are the ones talking about free speech.
right.
In the extreme Elon Musk and Twitter and all of that stuff. And you've got the left, or the liberal left, talking about identity politics, culture wars. You can't say that. You've got to erase history. Speech needs to be constrained. Everything is offensive. Like, it has kind of flipped.
Yeah, it's something that I think uh yeah, in the book I stole it from somebody. I can't remember who I stole it from. Like this idea there's the alt right and the control left, right? These two sides playing off one another. And
Yeah.
and people get mad when you frame it in that term because they're like they think you're especially the lefties get mad they because I've been accused of moral equivalence, saying that that the woke left is just as bad as the the right that wants to the diagolon or the convoy right. And it's like I'm not making judgment of who's worse here. I'm just saying it takes two to play this game, and they're both
Yeah.
playing the game.
And they're both playing the game. The counterculture today, then, I mean, it is, you've got the movie stars that are out there for all their causes and being very active political players. But you're also seeing, like, I thought recently, the Bud Light controversy was pretty interesting in terms of the pushback. We've seen hockey players say, no, we're not doing Pride Week. Um, is this just a rebalancing, or is it a rebound?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I kind of deliberately stayed away from the Bud Light thing. I mean, I could see sort of what it was more or less about, and I kind of thought I'm not going to get into that.
Yeah, no, it's trouble.
Well, it just there's only so much mental bandwidth you have, right, in a given day, and at a certain point, it's like you got to pick your fights about, or pick the things you're going to
Right.
pay attention to. Um, I think one of the interesting things, and I go back to when Joe Heath and I were writing the Rebel Cell. The absolute worst thing in our culture was brands.
Yeah.
Like brands were just horrific things, right? And it's so funny now to think like,
You
we all
got your
read No
shirt on
Logo
there.
and
You got your shirt on there. Be
yeah, I got my
careful.
shirt in there, right? Yeah, but like brands were like, and there was Adbusters
Yeah.
magazine and Naomi Klein's the logo, and we were all like fighting over this, right? And now it's like, God, brands. I'd love a good brand, I wish a brand was back. Um, and but I think what I find personally, maybe this is because I'm Gen X, I find distasteful about this is how everything gets fed into the political maw now, to the point where companies have to take political stances. They feel the need to play the culture war game in a way they didn't before. I kind of liked it back when everyone could just hate brands, right? But now you got to pick which brands are on your side and which brands aren't on the
Right.
other. I think that's a problem. And if I were running a company, I would be telling my social media people to stay the heck out of a lot of these fights.
Yeah.
You might have seen it. The guy who developed Bud Light came out yesterday and he said I spent 20 years making Bud Light the number one beer brand in America, and they destroyed it in a week. He
Yeah.
said this is like crazy town, right? Is it a rebalancing of things? I think what it is it's a sign of just the way in which politics is now disinfecting everything. And we may be just going through a period where we're all crazy. Maybe in 10 years we'll all look back at the second decade of the 21st century and think, man, when were we ever crazy then, right? Just like in the early 90s when we were all crazy on campus.
Yeah.
I hope that's the case, but I worry that we're getting the vectors for this, in particular the internet, which is easy to blame the internet, but in particular the internet is making it very hard for us to sort of get out of these gravitational fields we're in politically.
No, I mean, you had a great line, something, we seem to be missing the forest for the tweets. I think which is,
Right.
it's, I don't know. I read it in one of your pieces somewhere. I don't know if you
Yeah.
made it or borrowed
I
it,
think it's
but
in the book. Yeah,
it's
it's
in
in
the
the
book,
Klein book, I think.
but it
Yeah.
is kind of that, like, are we missing the big picture or maybe not? Like when you talk about every year that as seems is the worst one yet. I mean,
Yeah.
it does feel like that. I'm sitting on planes beside people or at work and they were going, the world feels like it's off its axis somehow. But we have been there before. We have felt that before.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best things, and to a certain extent, this tells against my thesis, right? It's a while ago I read a book about 1968, which is one of the all-time craziest years, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when you just look at what happened and the pace of assassinations, right, and the
Yeah.
pace and then the
War,
Chicago thing,
change.
it was
Yeah.
it was crazy, right? So I always have to remember, right? There was a time when America in particular, but the world more generally, really was kind of going off the rails. Um, but I do think, I mean, to go back to sort of the bigger picture, and when you say the forest, like when I think about the forest, I think it's a really big forest. I'm not talking about Canada, and I'm not talking
Right.
about the next 5 years. I'm talking about 50, 100 years from now. And so to go back to that list of trends you identified at the very beginning, right, that I quoted, one of the most worrisome one, right, is the decline of children, right,
Yeah.
family size, and so on.
Not having babies.
Not on babies, and you've probably talked to them, right? Daryl Bricker and John Ibbotson wrote their
Yep.
book,
Yep.
Empty Planet, I think
Empty
it was
planet. Yep.
called. I mean, this is a serious problem, right? And I think they're absolutely right. We're still hung up with this 1970s view that overpopulation is the problem. It's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it very, very disheartening when you read about, people aren't having sex. Like, you're not having sex. Like, sex is like, intimacy and family, and this stuff's very important. It's like really important.
I just got to put this, I got to read this because it's great. Our political systems have become impossibly polarized. Our economies stagger from one crisis to the next. The welfare state is bumping up against the limits imposed by escalating costs and diminishing capacity. Then you go on through this, we're losing faith in institutions, social capital is depleted, levels of patriotism. Everyone's more or less given up on having kids, and close to a third of men aged 18 to 30 haven't had sex in the past year. That's stunning.
Yeah, it's stunning, right? And I think back. Well, I mean, you lived through it, right? The panic about teenage sex and teenage pregnancy and so on, right?
Yeah.
Now it's like, guys, Go outside. There we go. Go make out, right?
At least you're going to have some fun
Yeah,
carefully.
that's like, yeah, like carefully. It's like I really worry about this. And it's wrapped up into a whole lot of things. It's wrapped up into housing, and it's very easy for
Yeah.
us to say, like my mom was like, I had you at 22, I had your sister at 20. We just sort of carried around in the back of the
Yeah.
RV or whatever, right? But the world's changed, right? And for whatever reasons, people just simply feel that they can't, they won't. The intimacy is gone. The pandemic made it all worse. Like I really, so that when I talk about the big picture, the forest, that's the forest, right? The forest is like,
Yeah.
where is everybody going, right? What are we doing? How many people can be alone into their 30s and 40s and not have that have a profound social impact?
Yeah. It's really great to talk to you. And in the first place, I feel better because having read all your stuff, I thought, oh my God, he's gonna be sitting in a dark room when we have this
No, it's
conversation.
all good.
But I'm kidding.
Yeah.
But it really is stuff we have to think about and we have to wrestle it. And you can't fix it if you don't say it out loud, right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think
Yeah,
that's
what policy proposals come out of it all? Who knows, right? That's your
Yes,
job.
who knows what happens there, but we gotta start thinking about it. Andrew Potter, so he teaches young minds at McGill University's Maxwell School of Public Policy. That's a good thing, I
Yeah,
think. Former journalist, so we share that kind of
that's a good
understanding and
thing.
vantage point on the world. So, but this, and we didn't even get to this. We'll talk about this another time, this authenticity hoax, because boy, I think we're in it again. I think
That'd
every
be
time
fun.
you stand up and say, I'm being authentic, you are most clearly not being authentic.
Yeah, I think that's
It's,
as true now as it's ever been. But yeah,
yes, it's
we should
the
talk
big
about it.
hoax.
Like
And the
when Justin Ling's piece
cell,
comes out, I'll send it to you. We should talk about it.
yeah, okay. And
Sorry.
then this new one on decline, stagnation, nostalgia, and why every year is the worst year. But this is the philosopher's job. So go philosophize and
Thank you.
come up with some answers for us here. Great talking with you.
Yeah, thank you. It's great
Thanks,
talking to you. Take care. Have a good
Andrew
weekend.
Potter. We'll talk to you soon. That's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin.